Definition of slavery and its characteristics. Slavery, as an institution, involves the ownership and exploitation of individuals as property. It is characterized by the stripping away of personal freedom, coercive control, and the imposition of forced labor. The enslaved are considered the legal property of their masters, deprived of autonomy and subjected to harsh, often brutal conditions. Slavery is marked by a profound power imbalance, where the enslaved have no legal rights and are denied basic human dignity. Enslaved people can be bought, sold, traded, and inherited, much like livestock or commodities. This dehumanization is central to the institution of slavery, which reduces individuals to mere instruments for economic gain and social status. Ancient roots of slavery in civilizations like Egypt, Greece, and Rome. The practice of slavery has ancient origins, deeply embedded in the history of human civilizations. In ancient Egypt, slavery was integral to society and economy, with slaves performing various functions ranging from domestic service to labor in construction and agriculture. The famous pyramids and monumental architecture of Egypt were built using the labor of enslaved individuals, including prisoners of war and those indebted or born into slavery. In ancient Greece, slavery was a common practice and an accepted social norm. Slaves were used in households, farms, mines, and even as skilled artisans. They were essential to the economy and daily life, enabling the leisure and cultural pursuits of the free citizens. Greek slavery was diverse, with some slaves experiencing relatively benign conditions while others faced severe hardship, especially in labor-intensive roles like mining. The Roman Empire further institutionalized slavery, making it a cornerstone of its economy and society. The Romans enslaved people from conquered territories, integrating them into various aspects of daily life and commerce. Slaves in Rome were ubiquitous, serving as household servants, laborers, gladiators, and even clerks and teachers. The scale of slavery in Rome was vast, and the treatment of slaves varied widely, though many endured brutal conditions, particularly those working in agriculture and mining. Despite the differences in how slavery was practiced across these ancient civilizations, several commonalities exist. Slavery was often justified through warfare, debt, or birth, and the enslaved were regarded as property devoid of personal rights. The institution was both a means of economic exploitation and a reflection of social hierarchies, where free citizens maintained their status and privileges through the subjugation of others. Distinct nature of chattel slavery in the Americas. The form of slavery that emerged in the Americas, known as chattel slavery, was distinct in its scale, racial dimension, and brutality. Unlike many ancient forms of slavery, which could be temporary or conditional, chattel slavery in the Americas was a permanent and hereditary condition. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were considered personal property, chattel, of their masters for life, and this status was passed down through generations. This system was legally codified and enforced, creating a rigid and dehumanizing structure that differed starkly from previous practices. Chattel slavery in the Americas was deeply intertwined with racial ideologies that classified Africans as inherently inferior and suited for enslavement. This racialization of slavery was not present in the same way in ancient systems, where slavery was often more fluid and not exclusively tied to race. The racial dimension of American slavery justified and perpetuated a brutal and dehumanizing system that treated enslaved people as expendable resources. The brutality of chattel slavery in the Americas was evident in the harsh working conditions, particularly in plantation agriculture. Enslaved people were subjected to grueling labor, physical punishment, and severe restrictions on their movement and autonomy. The economic drive for profit in the cultivation of cash crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton led to the exploitation and dehumanization of millions of Africans. In conclusion, While slavery has existed throughout human history, the chattel slavery that developed in the Americas was uniquely severe and dehumanizing. It was characterized by its permanence, racial basis, and extreme brutality, leaving a lasting and painful legacy that continues to influence societies today. Understanding this distinct form of slavery is crucial for comprehending the full impact of the Atlantic slave trade and its enduring consequences. Origins of the Atlantic slave trade. Early 16th century European exploration and colonization. The origins of the Atlantic slave trade are deeply rooted in the early 16th century European exploration and colonization of the Americas. European powers, driven by the promise of new lands and untapped resources, embarked on transoceanic voyages that led to the discovery of the New World. Spain and Portugal were at the forefront of these explorations, with figures like Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama opening new routes and claiming territories. The primary motivations for these explorations were economic gain, the spread of Christianity, and the expansion of European empires. The initial contact between Europeans and the indigenous populations of the Americas set the stage for the exploitation that would follow. Europeans sought to establish profitable colonies, and the labor-intensive nature of agriculture in the New World, particularly in the cultivation of cash crops like sugar, tobacco, and later, cotton, necessitated a substantial and reliable labor force. Initial use of indigenous labor and transition to African slaves. In the early stages of colonization, European settlers initially turned to the indigenous populations of the Americas to meet their labor demands. Indigenous people were forced into labor through systems like the encomienda in Spanish colonies, where colonists were granted the right to extract labor and tribute from native communities. However, this system proved unsustainable. The indigenous population rapidly declined due to diseases brought by Europeans, to which they had no immunity, brutal working conditions, and violent conflicts. The dramatic reduction in the indigenous workforce prompted European colonizers to seek alternative sources of labor. They turned to Africa, where the concept of slavery was not new. African societies had long practiced various forms of slavery, often involving prisoners of war or individuals in debt bondage. The existing African slave trade networks and the perceived resilience of Africans to tropical diseases made them a target for European slavers. Role of European powers in establishing the slave trade. European powers played a central role in the establishment and expansion of the Atlantic slave trade. Portugal was the first to engage in the trade on a large scale, establishing trading posts along the West African coast and transporting enslaved Africans to their colonies in Brazil. Spain followed suit, incorporating African slaves into their colonial labor systems in the Caribbean and mainland Americas. As the demand for labor grew, other European nations, including England, France, and the Netherlands, entered the trade. They established extensive trading networks, building forts and ports along the African coast to facilitate the capture, sale, and transport of enslaved Africans. European traders exchanged goods such as guns, alcohol, and manufactured items for slaves, integrating the slave trade into a global economy. The infamous Middle Passage, the transatlantic journey from Africa to the Americas, became the most brutal leg of this trade. Enslaved Africans were packed tightly into ships, enduring horrific conditions that led to high mortality rates. Upon arrival in the Americas, they were sold to plantation owners and subjected to grueling labor and inhumane treatment. Role of Africans in creating the slave trade. The role of Africans in the Atlantic slave trade was complex and multifaceted. While European demand drove the trade, it would not have been possible without the cooperation and participation of African rulers, merchants, and intermediaries. Some African kingdoms and states actively engaged in the trade, capturing and selling their enemies or rivals to European slavers. This involvement was often motivated by economic gain, political power, and access to European goods and firearms. African involvement varied greatly across the continent. In some regions, powerful states like the Kingdom of Dahomey and the Ashanti Empire grew wealthy and powerful through their participation in the slave trade. In others, smaller polities and local leaders engaged in the trade to protect their communities or enhance their status. It is important to recognize that African participation in the slave trade was not uniform or monolithic. Many African societies resisted the trade and its devastating impact on their communities. The entanglement of African and European interests created a complex system where both collaboration and conflict coexisted. In conclusion, the origins of the Atlantic slave trade are rooted in early European exploration and colonization, the initial exploitation of indigenous labor, and the subsequent transition to African slaves. The active roles played by European powers and certain African groups highlight the intricate and often tragic interplay of economic, political, and social factors that fueled the trade. This historical reality underscores the profound and far-reaching consequences of the Atlantic slave trade, shaping societies on both sides of the Atlantic for centuries to come. The routes and mechanics of the slave trade. Overview of the triangular trade system. The Atlantic slave trade was an integral part of the triangular trade system, a complex and highly profitable network connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas. This system operated from the 16th to the 19th century and involved the exchange of goods, people, and capital across 3 continents. European nations such as Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands played key roles in this trade, establishing a vast maritime empire fueled by the exploitation of enslaved Africans. The triangular trade system consisted of 3 distinct legs. The first leg involved the shipment of European manufactured goods, such as textiles, firearms, alcohol, and metalware, to Africa. These goods were traded for enslaved Africans, who were captured through wars, raids, and trading networks established by European and African intermediaries. The second leg, known as the Middle Passage, was the transatlantic journey that forcibly transported millions of Africans to the Americas under horrific conditions. The third leg saw the export of plantation-produced goods like sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee from the Americas to Europe, where they were sold for substantial profits. Detailed examination of the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was the most harrowing segment of the triangular trade, characterized by its brutality and high mortality rates. Enslaved Africans, often captured far inland, were marched to coastal forts and trading posts, where they awaited transport. Once aboard the slave ships, they were packed tightly into the holds, with little regard for their health or dignity. These ships were designed to maximize profit by transporting as many enslaved people as possible, resulting in extremely cramped and unsanitary conditions. During the Middle Passage, enslaved Africans faced appalling conditions. They were shackled, given minimal food and water, and subjected to extreme heat and filth. The lack of adequate sanitation led to the spread of diseases such as dysentery, smallpox, and measles. The death rate during these voyages was staggeringly high, with estimates suggesting that 15 to 20% of enslaved Africans did not survive the journey. Those who resisted or fell ill were often thrown overboard to prevent the spread of disease or to avoid the hassle of dealing with the sick. The psychological and physical trauma endured by the captives was immense. Families were torn apart, and individuals were stripped of their identities and subjected to dehumanizing treatment. The sheer brutality of the Middle Passage left deep scars on the survivors, who arrived in the Americas traumatized and weakened, only to face further exploitation and hardship on plantations. Conditions aboard slave ships and the journey's impact on enslaved Africans. The conditions aboard slave ships were appalling, with enslaved Africans crammed into small spaces with barely enough room to move. The lack of ventilation and the oppressive heat made breathing difficult, and the stench of bodily fluids and waste was overwhelming. Captives were chained together, restricting their movement and causing injuries from chafing and sores. They were fed a meager diet of gruel or beans, insufficient to maintain health during the grueling voyage. The physical impact of the Middle Passage on enslaved Africans was severe. Many suffered from malnutrition, dehydration, and diseases contracted during the journey. The cramped conditions led to outbreaks of illnesses such as scurvy and typhus, exacerbating the death toll. The psychological toll was equally devastating, with captives enduring constant fear, uncertainty, and trauma from the brutal treatment and the loss of their homeland and families. Upon arrival in the Americas, the surviving enslaved Africans were subjected to further degradation. They were taken to auction blocks, where they were inspected, prodded, and sold to the highest bidder. The process of seasoning followed, during which the enslaved were broken in and acclimatized to the harsh conditions of plantation life. This included learning new languages, adapting to new agricultural practices, and enduring physical punishment to enforce compliance. The forced labor and brutal conditions on plantations in the Caribbean, Brazil, and the American South perpetuated a cycle of violence and exploitation. Enslaved Africans worked from dawn to dusk, performing grueling tasks under the watchful eyes of overseers. Resistance was met with severe punishment, including whipping, mutilation, and even death. Conclusion: the routes and mechanics of the Atlantic slave trade illustrate the profound cruelty and inhumanity of this system. The triangular trade connected continents in a network of exploitation, driven by economic greed and racial ideologies. The Middle Passage, as a central component of this system, exemplified the extreme suffering endured by millions of Africans. Understanding these routes and mechanics is essential to comprehending the full impact of the Atlantic slave trade and its lasting legacy on the Americas and the world. The role of African involvement. Complexity of African involvement. The involvement of African societies in the Atlantic slave trade was multifaceted and complex, influenced by a variety of factors including economic interests, political dynamics, and social structures. African participation ranged from active engagement in the capture and sale of slaves to resistance and attempts to protect communities from enslavement. Understanding the diverse roles played by Africans in the slave trade is essential for a comprehensive view of this historical period. African kingdoms and the slave trade. Some African kingdoms and states were key players in the Atlantic slave trade, leveraging their involvement for economic and political gain. Powerful West African states like the Kingdom of Dahomey, the Ashanti Empire, and the Kingdom of Congo engaged in the trade, capturing and selling prisoners of war, criminals, and other vulnerable individuals. These kingdoms saw the slave trade as a means to acquire European goods, including firearms, which were used to consolidate power, expand territories, and maintain internal order. The Kingdom of Dahomey, for example, was heavily involved in the slave trade during the 18th and 19th centuries. The Dahomey military conducted raids on neighboring regions to capture slaves, who were then sold to European traders. In return, Dahomey received weapons and other valuable goods, which strengthened its military capabilities and political influence. The Ashanti Empire similarly utilized the slave trade to acquire firearms and other European goods, enhancing its regional dominance. Economic motivations and benefits. For many African leaders, the slave trade presented significant economic opportunities. The exchange of enslaved individuals for European goods allowed African rulers to enhance their wealth and status. Goods such as textiles, alcohol, and metalware were highly valued and played a crucial role in local economies and social hierarchies. The influx of European goods also facilitated the development of new economic activities and the expansion of existing ones. The economic benefits of the slave trade were not limited to the ruling elites. Local merchants and traders also participated in the trade, acting as intermediaries between European buyers and African suppliers. These merchants often played crucial roles in the capture and transport of slaves, navigating the complex networks of trade routes and negotiating with various stakeholders. Social and political dynamics. The participation of African societies in the slave trade was influenced by social and political dynamics. In some cases, the trade was seen as a means of survival and adaptation in a rapidly changing world. Faced with threats from rival states and the destabilizing effects of European colonization, some African communities engaged in the trade to protect themselves and their interests. The slave trade also had significant social implications. It contributed to the erosion of traditional social structures and the displacement of populations. The capture and sale of individuals often targeted marginalized groups, including prisoners of war, debtors, and those accused of crimes. This targeting exacerbated existing social tensions and contributed to the destabilization of African societies. Resistance and opposition. While many African leaders and merchants participated in the slave trade, there were also instances of resistance and opposition. Some African communities actively resisted the encroachment of slavers and sought to protect their populations from capture. For example, the Kingdom of Benin, under the leadership of Oba Assaji in the 16th century, initially resisted the slave trade, refusing to participate in the sale of its people. However, economic pressures and external threats eventually led to the kingdom's involvement in the trade. Resistance also took the form of armed conflict and rebellion. Some African states and communities fought against slave raiders and European traders, seeking to defend their sovereignty and autonomy. These efforts, however, were often overwhelmed by the combined forces of African collaborators and European military technology. Conclusion. The role of Africans in creating the Atlantic slave trade was complex and multifaceted, shaped by economic interests, political dynamics, and social structures. While some African kingdoms and states actively engaged in the trade for economic and political gain, others resisted and opposed the exploitation of their people. The participation of African societies in the slave trade underscores the intricate and often tragic interplay of local and global forces that fueled this dark chapter of human history. Understanding this complexity is crucial for a nuanced and comprehensive view of the Atlantic slave trade and its enduring impact on African and global history. Scale and demographics of the slave trade. Statistics and estimates of enslaved Africans transported. The Atlantic slave trade was a massive, transcontinental operation that forcibly transported millions of Africans to the Americas over several centuries. Historians estimate that between 12 to 15 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic from the early 16th century until the 19th century. However, these figures represent only those who survived the brutal Middle Passage. Many more perished during capture, on the journey to the coast, or while awaiting transport in coastal holding facilities. The trade reached its peak during the 18th century, when the demand for labor in the burgeoning plantation economies of the New World was at its highest. During this period, an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 Africans were transported annually. The scale of this human trafficking enterprise was unprecedented, reflecting the vast economic interests at stake for European colonizers and the devastating impact on African societies. Demographic impact on African societies. The demographic impact of the Atlantic slave trade on African societies was profound and multifaceted. The removal of millions of individuals, primarily young and able-bodied men and women, disrupted social structures and economic systems. Many African communities experienced significant population losses, which hindered their ability to sustain agricultural production, economic development, and social cohesion. The loss of such a large portion of the population had far-reaching consequences. It led to a demographic imbalance, with fewer men available for military service, farming, and other essential activities. This imbalance often resulted in increased polygamy and a heavier burden on women, who had to take on additional roles to compensate for the loss of male labor. The constant threat of capture and enslavement also forced many communities to relocate, often to less fertile and more remote areas, further straining their resources and resilience. The capture and sale of individuals also exacerbated existing conflicts and created new ones. Rivalries between African states were often fueled by the desire to control and profit from the slave trade. Powerful states and kingdoms, such as Dahomey and the Ashanti Empire, engaged in frequent warfare to capture slaves, leading to widespread violence and instability. Major destinations of enslaved Africans in the Americas. Enslaved Africans were transported to various regions in the Americas, with different colonies and countries receiving differing numbers of captives based on their labor demands and economic structures. The primary destinations included Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America. Brazil received the largest number of enslaved Africans, with estimates suggesting that about 5 million individuals were transported to Portuguese-controlled territories. Brazil's economy relied heavily on labor-intensive sugar plantations and later, coffee plantations, which drove the continuous demand for enslaved labor. The Caribbean islands, including Jamaica, Barbados, and Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, were also major recipients of enslaved Africans. The plantation economies in these regions focused on sugar, tobacco, and later, cotton production, which required a vast and constant influx of enslaved labor. The harsh conditions on Caribbean plantations resulted in high mortality rates, necessitating the continual importation of new enslaved workers. North America, particularly the southern colonies and later states, received a smaller but still significant number of enslaved Africans, estimated at around 500,000 to 600,000 individuals. The economies of these regions were heavily dependent on labor-intensive crops such as tobacco, rice, and, most notably, cotton. The invention of the cotton gin in the late 18th century greatly increased the demand for enslaved labor in the American South. Impact on the Americas. The influx of enslaved Africans had a profound impact on the demographic, economic, and cultural landscapes of the Americas. The labor of enslaved people was crucial to the development of the plantation economy, which generated immense wealth for European colonizers and fueled the growth of global trade networks. The exploitation of enslaved labor enabled the production of valuable cash crops, which were essential to the economies of the colonies and later, independent states. The presence of a large enslaved population also significantly influenced the social and cultural fabric of the Americas. African cultures, traditions, and practices were brought to the New World, where they mixed with European and indigenous influences to create new, syncretic cultural expressions. These cultural contributions, from music and cuisine to religion and language, have left a lasting legacy on the societies of the Americas. Conclusion. The scale and demographics of the Atlantic slave trade reveal the extensive and devastating impact of this transcontinental enterprise. The forced migration of millions of Africans not only reshaped the societies of the Americas, but also had profound and lasting consequences for African communities. Understanding the scope and effects of the slave trade is essential for acknowledging its historical significance and its enduring legacy in shaping the modern world. Economic factors driving the slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade was fundamentally driven by economic factors, as European powers sought to exploit the labor of enslaved Africans to maximize profits from their colonies in the New World. The economic motivations behind the trade were multifaceted, involving the demand for labor-intensive crops, the profitability of slavery, and the integration of the trade into the global economy. Demand for labor-intensive crops. The primary economic driver of the Atlantic slave trade was the demand for labor-intensive crops such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and indigo. These crops were highly profitable but required substantial labor to cultivate and process. European settlers in the Americas quickly realized that their labor needs could not be met by the indigenous population, whose numbers were decimated by disease and conflict, or by European indentured servants, who were insufficient in number and often unwilling to endure the harsh conditions of plantation work. Sugar, in particular, became the cornerstone of the plantation economy in the Caribbean and Brazil. The production of sugar was labor-intensive and required a constant and reliable workforce. Enslaved Africans provided the necessary labor force to work the plantations, enabling the mass production of sugar for export to Europe. The profitability of sugar plantations created a vicious cycle where the demand for labor fueled the expansion of the slave trade, and the availability of enslaved labor fueled the expansion of sugar production. Economic profitability of slavery. Slavery was immensely profitable for European colonists and investors. The cost of purchasing and transporting enslaved Africans was outweighed by the profits generated from their labor. Enslaved people were considered valuable property and a form of capital investment. Plantation owners could extract maximum labor from them with minimal costs for wages or benefits. This exploitation led to significant profits for plantation owners, merchants, and European investors who financed the trade. The profitability of slavery extended beyond the plantations. European merchants and shipowners profited from the transportation of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The construction and maintenance of slave ships, the purchase and sale of enslaved individuals, and the trade in goods produced by slave labor all contributed to the economic prosperity of European nations involved in the trade. The financial gains from the Atlantic slave trade helped to fund further exploration, colonization, and industrialization in Europe. Integration into the global economy. The Atlantic slave trade was not an isolated phenomenon but was deeply integrated into the global economy of the time. The trade was part of a complex network of economic exchanges that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The triangular trade system exemplified this integration, with European goods being exchanged for enslaved Africans, who were then transported to the Americas to produce goods that were shipped back to Europe. European nations established monopolies and chartered companies to control and regulate the trade. These entities, such as the British Royal African Company and the Dutch West India Company, played pivotal roles in organizing and financing the capture, transport, and sale of enslaved Africans. The profits generated from the trade were reinvested into European economies, fueling industrial growth and further economic expansion. The global demand for goods produced by enslaved labor, such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee, created an insatiable appetite that sustained the slave trade. These goods became staples of European consumption and were integral to the development of consumer cultures in Europe. The wealth generated by the trade also financed other economic ventures, including the establishment of new colonies and the expansion of existing ones. Impact on African economies. The economic factors driving the Atlantic slave trade had profound and devastating impacts on African economies and societies. The capture and sale of millions of Africans disrupted local economies and depopulated regions. African communities that engaged in the trade experienced shifts in power dynamics, as some groups gained wealth and influence through their participation, while others suffered from the loss of population and social cohesion. The focus on capturing and selling people for the slave trade diverted resources from other economic activities, such as agriculture and manufacturing. This dependency on the slave trade for economic gain created a cycle of violence and instability as African states and communities engaged in wars and raids to capture more people to meet European demand. The long-term economic impact on Africa was detrimental, hindering development and contributing to the continent's subsequent struggles with poverty and underdevelopment. Conclusion: the economic factors driving the Atlantic slave trade were central to its development and expansion. The demand for labor-intensive crops, the profitability of slavery, and the integration of the trade into the global economy created a system of exploitation that had profound and lasting impacts on Africa, the Americas, and Europe. Understanding these economic motivations is crucial to comprehending the full scope and consequences of the Atlantic slave trade, highlighting the interconnectedness of global economies and the human cost of economic exploitation. Social and cultural impact of the slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade had profound social and cultural impacts on both sides of the Atlantic. It reshaped societies, disrupted traditional cultures, and left a lasting legacy that continues to influence the world today. The social and cultural effects were complex and far-reaching, affecting enslaved Africans, African societies, and the societies of the Americas where they were forced to live and work. Disruption of African societies. The Atlantic slave trade profoundly disrupted African societies. The systematic capture and sale of millions of people caused significant demographic shifts, particularly in West and Central Africa, where the trade was most intense. The loss of a large portion of the population, particularly young men and women, weakened the social and economic structures of many African communities. This depopulation hindered agricultural production, technological advancement, and social cohesion. The slave trade also exacerbated existing conflicts and created new ones. African rulers and merchants who participated in the trade often engaged in wars and raids to capture individuals to sell to European traders. This increased violence and instability, leading to the rise and fall of kingdoms and states. The introduction of European firearms in exchange for slaves further intensified conflicts as communities sought to protect themselves or expand their power. Cultural impact on enslaved Africans. For the millions of Africans forcibly taken from their homelands, the Atlantic slave trade resulted in a catastrophic loss of cultural identity. Enslaved individuals were stripped of their languages, traditions, and social structures. They were transported to unfamiliar lands where they had to navigate new cultures and harsh living conditions. Despite this, they managed to preserve and adapt elements of their cultural heritage, creating rich and diverse cultural expressions in the Americas. One of the most significant cultural impacts was the formation of African diasporic cultures in the Americas. Enslaved Africans from different regions, speaking different languages and practicing different traditions, were brought together in the Americas. They blended their diverse cultural practices to create new, hybrid cultures. This cultural fusion is evident in music, dance, religion, language, and cuisine across the Americas. Formation of African diaspora and cultural syncretism. In the Americas, enslaved Africans contributed to the creation of vibrant and resilient cultural communities. Despite the oppressive conditions of slavery, they maintained elements of their African heritage and combined them with European and indigenous influences. This process, known as cultural syncretism, gave rise to unique cultural practices and identities. In the Caribbean, for example, the African influence is evident in the development of musical genres such as reggae, calypso, and salsa. African rhythms, instruments, and vocal styles blended with European musical traditions to create new forms of expression. Similarly, in the United States, African musical traditions influenced the development of blues, jazz, gospel, and eventually rock and roll. Religion was another area where cultural syncretism flourished. Enslaved Africans brought their spiritual beliefs and practices with them, which often merged with Christianity, the dominant religion in the Americas. This fusion gave rise to unique religious practices such as Vodou in Haiti, Santeria in Cuba, and Candomblé in Brazil. These religions preserved African spiritual elements while incorporating aspects of Catholicism and indigenous beliefs. Social structures and hierarchies. The Atlantic slave trade also influenced social structures and hierarchies in both Africa and the Americas. In Africa, the trade reinforced and sometimes created new social stratifications. Some African societies that engaged heavily in the trade gained wealth and power, while others were decimated and marginalized. This had long-term effects on social dynamics and contributed to the formation of new states and political entities. In the Americas, the introduction of African slaves created racially stratified societies. Slavery institutionalized racial hierarchies that privileged European settlers and their descendants while dehumanizing Africans and their descendants. These racial hierarchies were codified in laws and social practices, leading to systemic racism and discrimination that persisted long after the abolition of slavery. Enduring legacy. The social and cultural impacts of the Atlantic slave trade are still felt today. The legacy of racial inequality and discrimination rooted in the slave trade continues to shape social and political landscapes in the Americas and beyond. The cultural contributions of African descendants have enriched global culture, influencing music, art, cuisine, and language. The resilience and creativity of African diasporic communities are testaments to the enduring spirit of those who endured the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade. Conclusion. The social and cultural impacts of the Atlantic slave trade were profound and far-reaching. The trade disrupted African societies, led to the formation of new cultural identities in the Americas, and established enduring social hierarchies and racial inequalities. Understanding these impacts is crucial to recognizing the full scope of the Atlantic slave trade's legacy and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. Resistance and rebellion. The Atlantic slave trade and the institution of slavery were met with continuous resistance and rebellion by enslaved Africans. These acts of defiance took many forms, from everyday acts of resistance to large-scale uprisings, demonstrating the unyielding human spirit and desire for freedom. This part explores the various ways in which enslaved Africans resisted their oppression and the impact of their resistance on the broader struggle against slavery. Everyday acts of resistance. Everyday acts of resistance were a common and pervasive form of defiance among enslaved Africans. These acts, though often subtle, were significant in challenging the system of slavery and asserting personal agency. Enslaved people engaged in various forms of passive resistance, including work slowdowns, feigned illness, and sabotage of tools and machinery. These acts disrupted the efficiency of plantation operations and served as a form of protest against their forced labor. Cultural resistance was another crucial aspect of everyday defiance. Enslaved Africans preserved their cultural heritage through music, dance, religious practices, and oral traditions. These cultural expressions provided a sense of identity and community, fostering resilience and solidarity among the enslaved population. Secret gatherings for religious worship, storytelling, and communal activities helped to maintain a sense of hope and resistance against the dehumanizing conditions of slavery. Maroon communities. One of the most significant forms of resistance was the establishment of Maroon communities. Maroons were groups of escaped enslaved people who formed independent settlements in remote areas, such as swamps, mountains, and dense forests. These communities existed throughout the Americas, including the Caribbean, Brazil, and the southern United States. Maroon communities represented a powerful form of resistance, as they not only provided refuge for escaped slaves but also posed a direct challenge to the institution of slavery. Maroons often engaged in guerrilla warfare against colonial authorities, raiding plantations to free other enslaved individuals and acquire supplies. Notable Maroon leaders, such as Queen Nanny of Jamaica and Zumbi dos Palmares of Brazil, became symbols of resistance and freedom. The existence of Maroon communities forced colonial powers to allocate resources to suppress these settlements, highlighting the ongoing struggle and defiance of enslaved Africans. Despite efforts to eradicate them, many Maroon communities persisted for years, with some, like the Palenque de San Basilio in Colombia, enduring to this day as a testament to their resilience. Slave revolts and uprisings. Slave revolts and uprisings were among the most dramatic and impactful forms of resistance. Enslaved Africans organized and executed numerous rebellions, often at great personal risk. These uprisings were driven by the desire for freedom and justice and were a direct response to the brutality and inhumanity of slavery. One of the most famous slave revolts was the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which led to the abolition of slavery and the establishment of Haiti as the first independent Black republic. The revolution was led by figures such as Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and Henri Christophe, who inspired enslaved Africans to rise against their French oppressors. The Haitian Revolution had a profound impact on the global struggle against slavery, demonstrating that enslaved people could successfully overthrow their oppressors and achieve self-determination. Other notable uprisings include the Stono Rebellion, 1739, in South Carolina, the revolt led by Nat Turner, 1831, in Virginia, and the Demerara Rebellion, 1823, in British Guiana. These revolts, although often brutally suppressed, sent shockwaves through slave-owning societies and heightened fears among slaveholders. They also galvanized abolitionist movements, as the bravery and resilience of the rebels highlighted the inherent injustice of slavery. Impact of resistance on abolition. The resistance and rebellion of enslaved Africans played a crucial role in the eventual abolition of slavery. Acts of defiance challenged the moral and economic foundations of the slave system, forcing slaveholders and colonial powers to confront the untenable nature of their practices. The persistent resistance demonstrated that enslaved people would never passively accept their condition, undermining the stability of slave societies. Resistance also provided powerful narratives for abolitionist movements. Stories of bravery, such as those of Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, inspired abolitionists and garnered support for the anti-slavery cause. The visibility of resistance efforts, coupled with the moral arguments against slavery, created a powerful impetus for change. Conclusion. The resistance and rebellion of enslaved Africans were integral to the struggle against the Atlantic slave trade and the institution of slavery. From everyday acts of defiance to large-scale uprisings, enslaved people continuously fought for their freedom and dignity. Their resistance not only challenged the system of slavery but also played a pivotal role in its eventual abolition. Understanding these acts of defiance highlights the resilience and courage of those who endured and resisted one of the darkest chapters in human history. The abolition movement and its impact. The abolition movement, which sought to end the Atlantic slave trade and the institution of slavery, was a multifaceted and international effort that evolved over several centuries. Driven by moral, economic, and political factors, the movement mobilized a diverse range of advocates and strategies, ultimately leading to significant changes in legislation and societal attitudes. This part explores the origins, key figures, strategies, and impact of the abolition movement. Origins of the abolition movement. The origins of the abolition movement can be traced back to the late 18th century, when Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, and human rights began to challenge the morality of slavery. Intellectuals, religious leaders, and activists in Europe and the Americas began to question the ethics of slavery and advocate for its abolition. The movement was influenced by growing awareness of the brutal realities of the slave trade and the emerging moral arguments against it. Religious groups played a crucial role in the early abolition movement. Evangelical Christians, including Quakers and Methodists, were among the first to speak out against slavery. They argued that slavery was incompatible with Christian teachings and human dignity. The Quakers, in particular, were instrumental in organizing anti-slavery societies and promoting abolitionist ideas. Key figures and organizations. Several key figures and organizations were central to the abolition movement, each contributing in different ways to the fight against slavery. Their efforts ranged from grassroots activism to legislative lobbying and international advocacy. William Wilberforce, a British politician and leader of the British abolitionist movement, Wilberforce played a pivotal role in the campaign to end the slave trade in Britain. As a member of Parliament, he championed the cause through speeches, petitions, and legislative proposals. His tireless efforts culminated in the passage of the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act in 1807, which made it illegal to engage in the slave trade within the British Empire. Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave who became a prominent abolitionist and orator in the United States, Douglass was a powerful voice against slavery. His autobiographies, including Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, provided first-hand accounts of the brutality of slavery and helped to galvanize anti-slavery sentiment. Douglass's advocacy extended to supporting women's rights and other social reforms. Harriet Tubman, known for her role in the Underground Railroad, Tubman was a courageous conductor who helped hundreds of enslaved people escape to freedom. Her leadership in the abolitionist movement and her role as a spy and nurse during the Civil War highlighted her commitment to the cause of freedom and equality. Sojourner Truth, an African-American abolitionist and women's rights activist, Truth is best known for her powerful speeches, including Ain't I a Woman? Her advocacy for both abolition and women's rights was instrumental in broadening the scope of the movement and addressing intersectional issues. Strategies and tactics. The abolition movement employed a range of strategies to achieve its goals. These included public awareness campaigns. Abolitionists used pamphlets, books, and speeches to raise public awareness about the realities of slavery and the moral imperative to end it. Publications like Olaudah Equiano's The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano provided personal accounts of the slave experience and fueled public outrage. Petitions and lobbying. Abolitionists organized petitions and lobbied legislators to pass laws against slavery. In Britain, the Anti-Slavery Society collected signatures and presented petitions to Parliament, demonstrating widespread public support for abolition. Economic boycotts. In both Britain and the United States, abolitionists encouraged boycotts of goods produced by slave labor, such as sugar and cotton. These boycotts aimed to disrupt the economic foundation of slavery and demonstrate consumer opposition to the practice. Legal and political advocacy. Abolitionists worked within political systems to advocate for legal reforms. The British Parliament and the U.S. Congress saw heated debates and legislative battles over anti-slavery bills, with abolitionists playing a crucial role in shaping policy. Impact of the abolition movement. The abolition movement had a profound impact on both the Atlantic slave trade and the institution of slavery. In Britain, the passage of the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act in 1807 marked the beginning of the end for the British slave trade, followed by the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which abolished slavery throughout the British Empire. In the United States, the abolitionist movement contributed to the growing tensions between North and South over the issue of slavery. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865 was a direct result of these tensions, and the eventual passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865 formally abolished slavery in the U.S. Globally, the success of the abolition movement set a precedent for human rights activism and inspired subsequent social justice movements. The legacy of abolitionism continues to influence contemporary struggles for racial equality and human rights. Conclusion. The abolition movement was a complex and multifaceted effort that involved key figures, diverse strategies, and profound societal impacts. The movement's success in ending the Atlantic slave trade and the institution of slavery marked a significant milestone in the fight for human rights and justice. Understanding the origins, key players, and impact of the abolition movement provides insight into the enduring struggle for freedom and equality and highlights the power of collective action in challenging systemic injustices. Legacy and continuing impact. The legacy of the Atlantic slave trade and the institution of slavery continues to shape societies across the world. The ramifications of these historical injustices are felt in contemporary social, economic, and cultural contexts. Understanding this legacy is crucial for addressing ongoing issues related to racial inequality, historical memory, and reparative justice. Economic and social disparities. The economic and social impacts of the Atlantic slave trade are still evident today. In the Americas, the wealth generated from slave labor significantly contributed to the economic development of colonial powers and their successor states. However, the wealth and resources accumulated through slavery were not equally distributed, and the descendants of enslaved Africans often faced systemic disadvantages. In the United States, for instance, the legacy of slavery has contributed to enduring racial disparities in wealth, education, and employment. African American communities continue to grapple with the effects of historical disenfranchisement, including lower average incomes, higher poverty rates, and disparities in access to quality education and healthcare. These inequalities are a direct result of centuries of systemic racism and economic exploitation. In the Caribbean and Latin America, the legacy of slavery is also evident in socioeconomic disparities. Many countries in these regions have large Afro-descendant populations who face similar issues of economic inequality and social marginalization. The historical exploitation of African labor has left lasting imprints on national economies and social structures. Cultural contributions and identity. Despite the suffering imposed by slavery, African diasporic communities have made significant cultural contributions that have enriched societies across the globe. The cultural heritage preserved and adapted by enslaved Africans has influenced music, dance, literature, and cuisine in profound ways. In the United States, African American culture has had a major impact on music genres such as jazz, blues, hip-hop, and gospel. The literary and artistic expressions of African American writers and artists have also shaped American culture and discourse. Similarly, in the Caribbean and Latin America, African influences are evident in popular music genres like reggae, salsa, and samba, as well as in local culinary traditions. These cultural contributions are a testament to the resilience and creativity of African diasporic communities. They reflect a dynamic process of cultural synthesis that transcends the traumas of slavery, creating vibrant and influential cultural practices. Historical memory and education. The legacy of the Atlantic slave trade also influences how societies remember and educate about slavery. The historical memory of slavery varies widely, with some countries and communities actively engaging with this history, while others may underrepresent or omit it. In the United States, the teaching of slavery in schools has been a subject of ongoing debate. Efforts to accurately represent the history of slavery and its impact on African American communities are often met with resistance or revisionist narratives. However, Increased scholarship and advocacy have led to greater awareness and educational initiatives that address the complexities of slavery and its legacy. Similarly, in Europe, there has been growing recognition of the need to confront the colonial and slave trade histories of former imperial powers. Museums, educational programs, and public memorials are increasingly focusing on these histories to foster a more inclusive understanding of the past. Reparative justice and reconciliation. The legacy of the Atlantic slave trade has also led to discussions about reparative justice and reconciliation. Calls for reparations, whether financial, symbolic, or both, have been made by various groups advocating for acknowledgement and compensation for the historical injustices endured by enslaved Africans and their descendants. Reparative justice initiatives can include financial compensation, public apologies, educational programs, and investments in communities affected by the legacy of slavery. The goal is to address the long-term effects of slavery and provide opportunities for healing and redress. Some countries and institutions have taken steps toward reparative justice. For example, several Caribbean nations have initiated programs to address the socioeconomic impacts of slavery, while some universities and organizations have acknowledged their historical ties to the slave trade and made efforts to support affected communities. Conclusion. The legacy of the Atlantic slave trade and the institution of slavery continues to have a profound impact on contemporary societies. Economic and social disparities, cultural contributions, historical memory, and discussions about reparative justice all reflect the enduring effects of this dark chapter in history. By acknowledging and addressing these legacies, societies can work towards greater understanding, equity, and reconciliation, honoring the resilience and contributions of those who endured and resisted the injustices of slavery.